Welcome to the Friends of Dan Music Podcast. I'm Dan Miles. You've been listening to the music of Steve Adelson, who's joining us now on the phone from Long Beach, New York. Hi, Steve. Welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be on.
Well, the track we just heard is called And on Blue Guitar. It's an original composition that can be found on a CD that Steve released in 2007 called Adventures in Stickology. I think that title is very appropriate because Steve is a very adventurous musician, not only in his exploration of different musical styles, but also in his choice of instrument itself. Did you want to explain the basic features and the parameters of the Chapman Stick for those of our listeners who might not be familiar with it?
Absolutely, Dan. More and more people are familiar with the stick, of course, through the internet and things like that weren't around 25 years ago. The stick has been around commercially since 1974. Emmett Chapman, who's the inventor, obviously the name Chapman Stick, comes from his name. He invented this instrument to accommodate his tapping techniques that he discovered actually in 1969, where he had a prototype instrument. I think it had 7 or 9 strings, and then in 1974, I believe, was the first commercially available stick with 10 strings on it. So it's not just a 10-string guitar. It's called a stick because it has no body, so it just looks like a long piece of wood. It's got 10 strings right now. There's also a 12-string model and an 8-string model. It's got a unique tuning, which we could talk about a little later on. But the main difference about the instrument is it's designed with very low action for the player to tap the strings, which, for those who don't know, it's on a guitar. It's called hammer-ons, but it's kind of akin to a piano. The hammer's inside the piano, and when the hammers hit the strings vibrate, and that causes the sound. So what Emmett Chapman discovered, and obviously had to make an instrument to accommodate it, was that if you tap the strings and the strings have a certain kind of tension, sound will come out, and therefore you can use 8, 9, 10 fingers instead of on the guitar where you're holding something down and strumming it and only getting one sound. You can do many different parts, polyphony and harmony and all that kind of stuff all together. So that's the main feature, that you see somebody who plays the stick using all their fingers in this tapping technique that Emmett kind of solidified, and certain things, the way you hold your hands also that he discovered. Other people were tapping, but Emmett kind of codified the whole thing and made it into a unified system. So that's really what he's responsible, like I said, the instrument. If you want to go more into detail,
Well, you've got a 10-string and a 12-string model, and my understanding is the 10-string has 5 bass strings and 5 melody strings, and the Grand Stick has 6 bass strings, 6 melody strings, and it's actually a stereo instrument where you can separate the bass and melody strings and actually send them to different amps.
Mm-hmm. Yes, pretty much. If you have the 5 and 5 or 6 and 6, and the thing is also, it's like a guitar and a bass, but they're not tuned like a guitar and a bass. The melody side guitar strings, for those who know about music, are tuned in uniform fourths. On the guitar, it's not like that. The second and third string have a different interval, which is a third. So what happens on the guitar, when you have these shapes, when you play a chord, a lot of guitar players play shapes. They play bar chords and they play a C chord and a D chord. They're all different shapes. But on the stick, because it's uniform, the shapes are simplified, and it's less to actually learn as far as geometry and geography of the instrument.
Symmetrical. But the bass strings are tuned in fifths.
Right.
And melodies are in fourths. And how many frets is it, 25?
24, 25. The older models have, I think, one less fret, and now he's got a new model called the extra long or extra or whatever, where there's an extra kind of like negative fret on it.
Right, because I know that my understanding is it has no open strings. It's damped at the nut, and so you can't hit an open string. Is that right?
Well, you can, but it's going to be a little muted. The idea of the mute is that when you tap and you pull your fingers off, when you're playing rapidly, if you didn't have that mute, you'd get some extraneous sounds. So it's purity. And everything he put into the instrument in R&D over the years has been to get the most out of the instrument as far as the mutes and all the electronics and things like that. It's always progressing, and it's come a long way.
Well, now when you play a piano and you hit a note, you have a sustained pedal that enables you to sustain the note longer. How do you keep the notes from just dying out as you lift your fingers?
Well, part of it is just holding your finger down. If you take your finger off, obviously the string's going to stop vibrating. But since it's electric also, you can also accommodate that with reverb and delay and any kind of effects you want to put in. And as you mentioned before with the stereo effect, the reason for that, obviously, not only going through 2 amps and getting a nice surround sound, you might want to process the treble side different than the bass side. The bass, you want some articulation, And on the melody side, you can add distortion and delay and all that kind of stuff to make it fluffy. And this way, you don't feel like you have to distort the bass side as well. So it's a big advantage that way. So, if you want some sustain, if you want some ambiance or dirt, that's just in your processor, your guitar mechanics.
Well, one of the key features of the stick that separates it from every instrument I've seen is the concept of the interior low string, which really seems like a brilliant innovation. Usually if you have a guitar, your lowest notes are on the top of the instrument closest to you, and as you play away from yourself, you get higher and higher notes. But you've got a big, thick bass string like right down the middle of the instrument, which should enable you, as you get on higher notes, to be able to keep a bass line going.
Yeah, it's got other advantages also. Once you get to play the instrument, there are certain discoveries you make. And it's not kind of unique, it's unique. I don't know any other instrument that doesn't go from left to right or top to bottom. Piano goes one way. And what happens with the bass string in the middle is that with one hand you can actually play the bass string, and then with the other fingers play either other bass notes or melody strings and have a better reach for that. There's a lot of repetition in some of the notes. Obviously, you have 10 or 12 strings and 25 frets, then you're not going to have 500 unique notes, so there's a lot of unisons. And there's certain techniques that you could use, even utilizing your thumbs, that kind of cross-pollinate the bass and the melody side instead of keeping them separate as well. So the bass string being in the middle does help accommodate that.
Yeah, and speaking of your thumbs and the technique, I've watched clips of you playing, and it seems like your left thumb is usually behind the neck, since it's such a wide neck, and your right thumb I see you mainly using for maybe a downward gliss effect or percussive tapping. So is it accurate to say that you produce the majority of the notes with the 4 fingers on each hand?
Yeah, it's 4 fingers on each hand, and I do use the thumb for certain techniques, and usually probably when I play a melody side with my 4 fingers of my right hand, my thumb will come in and play, let's say, on the 11th or 12th string, which is in the bass territory. But since it's such a high bass string, it's actually in the pitch of the higher melody strings. So you kind of put them together and create a bigger sound.
Now, as a piano player, I'll often play chords with my left hand and solo with my right, or play chords with my right hand and a bass line with my left. But what I've seen you do is play a bass line with your left and solo with your right. How do you keep simultaneous single-note runs straight in your head?
Practice.
Yeah, so I've never really seen anybody do that,
Well, it's just, I guess when you learn an instrument, just you learn guitar or whatever, the main thing about the learning curve on the stick that makes it easy is that it's an easy instrument physically to play. When you play a guitar and you learn an F chord or a bar chord, sometimes the sound doesn't come out. And when you play a violin, sometimes the bow makes everything screech. And when you play the stick, you hit a note like on a piano, and it has to come out.
Yeah.
So the physicality of it is easy, and you can practice 8 hours a day and never get tired. You've worked out a way that the action's low, that the angle of the instrument when you tap is not putting any pressure on your wrists. So it kind of becomes addictive, and then you practice. And what I did, I guess, at the beginning, which is many, many years ago, is practice one hand at a time, learn where things are, scales, chords. And then, of course, the hard part is being an acrobat and putting them two things together, and then feeling comfortable where you can actually play a bass line or a chord thing with the left hand accompanying, and then maybe solo or play a melody in the right hand, and feeling comfortable playing both sides and relaxed where you can actually think and create.
When did you first become aware of the Chapman Stick? Remember what year that was?
1983.
1983. And how long had you been a musician before you tried one?
Well, I started my history in 1969. It was the summer of Woodstock, and a friend of mine taught me a G chord because we were bored, and I was addicted. It was like giving me heroin. At the end of it. So I played guitar, and my first year or so, playing the songs of the time, the Beatles, and all that kind of stuff. And then I found fingerpicking, and I got into John Fahey and Leo Kottke and all the old blues guys like Mississippi John Hurt. Then I found a teacher named Charles Didier. If anybody knows where he is, that would be great. We can't find him, but he was a teacher I had in Brooklyn, and he exposed me to jazz guitar.
Yeah.
And at the time, I thought if I learned jazz guitar, even though I had all these rock roots and long hair and stuff, that I'd become the baddest rock guitar player in the world because I had this jazz vocabulary that I can apply to my Frank Zappa and Allman Brothers covers. And lo and behold, I became a Wes Montgomery addict and a Django Reinhardt addict. And I became a jazz guitar player. Played in the city with many, many fine players.
And who did you see playing the stick, or how did you hear about it?
Well, I saw a couple of guys tap the guitar. Michael Hedges, Stanley Jordan, of course, Van Halen, and there was a guitar expo at Madison Square Garden in New York, and part of Madison Square Garden, I think, was called the Felt Forum, and Emmett Chapman was demonstrating the stick. And since I was tapping a little on the guitar, and I saw him, I said, well, if I'm going to tap, this is the way to go.
Oh, yeah.
And Sam Ash at the time carried Chapman sticks, and with the help of Paul Ash, one of Sam Ash's owners, I got my first stick and changed my life.
Did you continue to play guitar too, or just completely convert?
Well, gradually. I mean, I had some beautiful, Super 400 guitars and Les Pauls and stuff like that. So I, wasn't within a week, but I found that I was practicing the stick more. It wasn't a conscious decision, but I don't know, a year or two later, I just realized that my guitars weren't being practiced. If you play an instrument, you get addicted to it. I found that putting more time into it obviously got better results than going back and forth. And I still play guitar because I taught guitar, and I still continue to do that too. But the stick, there's so much on the stick to learn and to get music out of it, and that's a great satisfaction. Is that unlike the guitar, which has a history, and if you want to be Jimi Hendrix or Segovia, you can buy videos and you can watch and you learn, but it's rare that something new comes out of it. The stick has very little history.
Right.
So it's very gratifying to discover techniques that maybe nobody's ever done before, do it for yourself, and also, trailblaze and show, future stick students, that there's a second and third generation now that are playing them. It's been around for 30-some-odd years. So, there are 19-year-olds and 20-year-olds that are picking up the stick for the first time, and they can learn from the people who've been doing it for 30 years.
And it sounds like the instrument's continually evolving, too.
Yep, the instrument physically and also technique-wise. The more players that use it, the more techniques that come out. Emmett's always trying to do, R&D as far as finding new pickups and new frets. He's an inventor, number one. Was a guitar player. Now he's spending a lot of time on the instrument itself. He still does play. He wakes up every day and I think plays for about an hour or so. He's a musician and inventor and genius. He invented an instrument. It's very hard to invent a new instrument. You can invent variations, and even though the guitar has its roots, the stick has its roots in guitar and bass, because of the tuning, because of the technique, because of the way it's laid out, it's none of the above.
Exactly. Well, I think this would be a good time to listen to some music. I'm going to play your version of a Stevie Wonder song I'm sure our listeners are going to recognize. It sounds like there are at least 3 or 4 players on this track, but I suspect that's not the case. You credit one guitarist on it, Ben Lacey. Are you doing everything else on the stick?
Yeah, well, it's me and Ben. Ben is a very percussive player. He's one of my favorite guitar players, and he does a lot of Victor Wooten-esque popping and slapping on the strings, and has some great harmonies. And we've been friends for many years, so we'll talk about the CD later. But we decided to do a couple of duets, and this was one of them that I enjoy the way he plays it. So we kind of integrated our strong points, and it's great if you can hear who's doing what, because that's the whole idea, is to make it a band kind of element.
Well, that's been one thing that's been unique about preparing for this show, because, and I'll mention this later too in some other specific instances, usually I can at least tell, there's a trumpet and a trombone and a drummer, and in this case I'm not quite sure. All right, well, let's go ahead and listen to it, and as I said, people are going to recognize this tune. Let's roll it, and we'll talk about it in a minute. for a track with no drummer on it, you've got quite a pocket going there.
Mm-hmm.
I noticed at least one of you was slapping the strings on the third beat of each measure, creating the energy of a snare drum. And I think that track is a good example of how the stick enables you to play bass, chords, solo notes, and percussion all at once. I mean, even as talented as he is, I don't think even Stevie tries to do that. Stevie Wonder himself.
Well, let's leave. I'm sure Stevie can do whatever he wants. He's a great musician, and it's an honor to play his music. And
oh yeah, I love him. Everybody loves him, but I've never seen him play that many things. Even you're more inside of his composition, I think, than even he can be.
Yikes. Okay. It's actually fun because I do a couple of his tunes, and I think one of the cool adventures of the stick, like I said, because it doesn't have a long history, is to try to play different kinds of music on the stick. So I will play Stevie, and I'll play Beatles, and there are guys who play classical music, and it's adapts to any kind of music. The trick that I find in finding arrangements is, if you're playing a Led Zeppelin song, how many parts can you play, including the drums and the vocals and stuff like that? But find it all on the stick and adapt it.
Yeah, it's a very orchestral type of concept. Well, one of the things I like about your albums is your generosity when it comes to sharing the musical spotlight. As a virtuoso performer yourself, you could easily make your albums all about you, but instead you seem to really enjoy collaborating with other musicians. We'll talk about some of them in a minute, but first I wanted to talk about a collaboration that unfortunately did not come to pass, at least not yet anyways. I'm talking about the situation with Steve Howe of Yes. You want to tell us what happened there?
Well, I used to write for a magazine called 20th Century Guitar, and basically it was a guitar magazine that was widespread, but they talked a lot about vintage guitars, and they would have guitar shows every year, bringing in vintage guitars from Stratocasters to jazz boxes. And Steve Howe from Yes is a great jazz collector. Actually collects all kinds of guitars. And he would come to the shows, and we became, kind of friendly. And one day he was in my booth where I was doing demos, and I said, do you think we can do a duo album together? And he actually agreed to do it. And I put plans into action. And somewhere down the road, as we were progressing, he sent me an email or something like that and said, I'm sorry, but I got to go on the road with some band called Yes or Asia or one of those bands. He doesn't usually multitask, so that kind of disappeared for a bit. And the studio was already booked, so that became the project of the last record, which I just called 9 Other Guitar Players.
You guys are both young. You can still do it someday.
Oh, we're going to still try. And what I was looking forward to, we're different styles. I mean, he's got his thing, but he plays a lot of different things. Is how do you write material for somebody's style? Whether it's Steve Howe or Steve Morse or whoever. You want to find a strong point in what they do, so the presentation will be accurate.
So it was going to be a duet album, and he was going to put the burden on you to compose all the music?
Well, he was, I don't know if it was a burden. It's actually fun. Basically, the album before was all originals. This was going to be kind of some covers and stuff like that. He's done a couple of duo albums and solo albums. And I was looking forward to the challenge of not just playing, but saying, okay, maybe the Stevie Wonder song would work, maybe it wouldn't, maybe we'd do a Beatles song, maybe we'd just throw in a Yes song, maybe some originals. We didn't know where it was going to go, but it never really got to that point. So. Okay,
well, let's talk about some of the people you have worked with. When I was asking you about your first exposure to the Chapman Stick, I can tell you when mine was. I remember it very clearly. It was in the early 80s. It was King Crimson, Elephant Talk. It was Tony Levin, and I saw and heard the instrument for the first time simultaneously. It was a TV performance, and I remember being intrigued by the sound and the look of that instrument. I mean, it kind of sounded like a bass, but it kind of sounded like a synthesizer, but it kind of wasn't either, And so I had that memory of it, and I know that Tony has played on a few of your CDs.
Yeah, Tony's played on lots of CDs. For people who don't know him, he's played on John Lennon CDs, Pink Floyd CDs.
Peter Gabriel.
Yeah, I shouldn't say John Lennon CDs. John Lennon vinyl records, maybe converted.
Right.
Later on.
He played on a Double Fantasy, I believe.
Yep, he was on that. I think he might have played with Lord Nero. I mean, everybody's on like millions of records. And the Stick community is a very small community, so we became acquaintances, 10, 15 years ago. And on a previous recording, I had asked him, and he agreed to be on one track, and I had gone up to upstate New York, and I recorded a track with him as a Stick duet with Jerry Murata on drum, who was also, I think, in Peter Gabriel's band.
Right.
that was fun, and we became friends over the years. And he did a track on this CD as well, but on this one I actually asked him to play fretless bass.
Was that Planetarium?
Yep, and I'm playing actually a MIDI stick on that, so you're hearing pads and string sections and things like that.
Yeah.
Which I think that maybe 2 or 3 times I've recorded it with a MIDI stick to get those kind of sounds, which kind of sound like synthesizer sounds.
Well, the interesting thing about Jerry Marotta, and I was thinking about, you don't usually hear too many examples of famous brother drummers, because of course his brother Rick Marotta played on the classic Steely Dan track Peg, which is probably the only thing he needs on his resume to get work for the rest of his life. Hey, I played on Peg on Asia. You can be in my band, man.
There you go. You passed the audition.
Well, speaking of drummers, I know you've also worked with Danny Gottlieb, who played drums on the first 3 Pat Metheny group albums.
Yeah, that was a treat. I haven't recorded with Danny,
right.
But we met at the NAMM show in California, which is a big trade show. And I was featured in an evening called the All-Star Guitar Night, and they usually have either innovative or famous guitar players on the bill, and they've had Chet Atkins and Les Paul and Adrian Belew, a lot of finger pickers, and you come out and do a solo, and Danny was like the house drummer, and I said, absolutely, and I play a lot of Pat Metheny tunes, so it was a joy to play with the actual drummer. I asked him if he would mind playing a Pat Metheny song. He said, absolutely, no problem, and we didn't record it. It's on video, actually. You can find it on YouTube. So it was great, and as a matter of fact, we just played again 2 weeks ago at the NAMM show. So,
yeah, you played Lone Jack with them, I think, on that first Pat Metheny album was great, San Lorenzo and stuff like that, American Garage. But oh my God, Off Ramp. That was the first Pat Metheny album I heard, and I thought, man, this guy is just like off in his own trip. This guy's awesome.
Right.
And for Danny Gottlieb to be the drummer on that. And you did have a chance to play briefly with Pat Metheny himself, right?
Yeah, going back to the magazine that I write for, I used to write for, they're no longer around, 20th Century Guitar. I used to do some interviews as well as write a theory column for them. And I interviewed Pat 3 times, and just for the sake of it, I would bring my stick when I did the interview. And one time I interviewed him in his loft space, and he said, you always bring that stick or something to that effect. Show me what you could do with it. And I took it out, and we played a little bit together, and I gave him like a little bit of a stick lesson. And it was nerve-wracking because he's my guy. And but we played together a little bit, and that was fun, and gave him a little stick lesson, and something I'll always remember.
Well, a guy with a musical curiosity like Pat Metheny I can definitely imagine him doing that.
Yeah, and I thought he would love it because he has this thing called a Picasso guitar, which has 42 strings.
Right.
He does some tapping and strumming, and I had a chance of playing. There are 2 of those, and I actually had a chance of playing the other one. So I thought he, would really like it, and he played it for a few minutes, and he got some music out of it. I'm sure he'd be a master if he had one in his possession, and maybe he will get one of these days.
I can picture him doing a stick album. He did an album, I forget which one it was. It was just like really kind of like noise. It was like a Sonic Youth kind of thing. He'll try anything.
Zero tolerance for something.
Yeah, Zero Tolerance for Silence, I think it was called.
Something like
it was just like him with a guitar cranked up, just banging on it.
Oh, yeah.
Way beneath his own musical skills. But I'm saying the guy's, he's like you. He's adventurous. He doesn't want to just rest on his laurels and et cetera. But, you mentioned Les Paul, and oh my God, talk about everybody's all-time hero. Did you actually get to play with him?
Yeah, I was probably about 3 years ago. Muriel Anderson, who runs this All-Star Guitar Night at the NAMM show, invited me to one of his Monday night shows in Manhattan at the Iridium, and she introduced me to him, and he invited me on stage to play with him. Because he would have his own trio up there, and then he would have guests, in his older age, especially to make it more variety kind of thing, and all kinds of players. George Benson's been there, and Keith Richards and all that. So, it was great to be up on stage with him. And, we joked around about the appearance of the instrument, and then he just said, play me something. And I think I might have done like a Django Reinhardt song or maybe Sleepwalk or something like that. And what I remember most, besides all the comedic relief about the instrument and that stuff, I just played a couple of measures, and he whispered in my ear, and this was in front of a full audience. The words were something like, you can come back anytime you want.
All right.
So like every 2 or 3 weeks I'd pop down there, we'd play a couple of songs and stuff like that, and it was a blast. And actually I did the last show he did at the Iridium. I sat in for that last show.
Wow. Well, the interesting thing about that is when he invented the solid body electric guitar, it originally, he called it the log. It was like a stick. It was just a neck, a pickup, and strings. but the audience wouldn't accept it, so he just put, the body on it to make it look like a guitar, and all of a sudden everybody loved it. So he might have had a place in his heart for that instrument.
Well, here's another funny story, actually. I think I'm accurate. There was somebody named Thumbs Carlisle who played, I think his guitar was on his lap, and he played with his thumbs mostly. And he knew Les, and he knew Emmett Chapman. And Les was looking for a house, and I think he introduced Les to Emmett, and I don't think they actually talked about guitars. Emmett actually showed him some real estate. So Emmett became like his real estate agent, and that was it. And they never talked about the stick or the guitar. And I'm paraphrasing.
That sounds like a Twilight Zone episode.
Right. Oh, you invented an instrument too? Okay, great.
Yeah.
And actually, just to take that a step further, after Les had died, Guitar Player magazine was doing a feature on him, because of all the contributions. At the same time, they had asked me to write a story about Emmett Chapman, which was delayed in publication, and it turned out that Emmett Chapman's story, which was a 5 or 6 page story, was in the same issue that had Les Paul on the cover, and Emmett was called an innovator. So, they met again in the magazine on his tribute, on Les Paul's tribute.
Well, I wanted to talk about an album you did called The Answers Inside. Mm-hmm. I know that that was one of the ones Tony Levin and Jerry Marotta and guitarist Larry Coryell all played on. Mm-hmm. You mentioned Pat Metheny. That album kind of has the vibe of a Letter from Home, Pat Metheny group kind of album. I don't know if it's the steel drums or the type of guitar solos, but just a generalization. But the song I want to play from it is actually different than that. It's your composition called Tap Dance. Mm-hmm. It's more of a straight-ahead jazz piece. Could you set up the personnel on that track for us?
Yeah, there's a fantastic drummer named Matt Wilson, he's won some Downbeat Awards. I mean, he's a great straight-ahead drummer and very innovative drummer as well. One of my favorites. He's actually, I guess you can call him a neighbor. He lives in Long Island as well, but travels the world. Favorite. I played with him a few times. It was great to record with him. And the piano player, originally, I had asked Kenny Barron to do it. Mm-hmm. And that just didn't work out, so I asked another friend named Dennis Moorman, and Dennis just played great. I mean, this is one of the his solo is one of the highlights, I think, of the CD. He was just a super player and a great guy. So that's the trio. It was just me, him, and Matt. The song is one of the first songs I've ever written. I think I recorded on a cassette tape about 400 years ago, and it just felt right, and the groove was good, and the guys played great on it.
Well, here's the thing. Anybody who heard this would think it was 4 musicians. Mm-hmm. A piano player, a drummer, a bass player, and a guitarist. And that's what I thought. But when they hear this and they hear the guitar solo, you're actually playing the bass and what sounds exactly like a guitar solo with, octave licks and, chord soloing, and you're playing the bass simultaneously. So that's a perfect example of that technique I was talking about before, where you're playing single note runs against each other. I've never heard anybody do that. It just blows my mind. Well, let's listen to it. This is from The Answers Inside. It's by Steve Adelson and the New Stick-Tet, and it's called Tap Dance.
we express ourselves.